20 bright students went into the woods for a school camping trip, and not a single one came back. What happened in Mountain Hollow shocked a nation, but what investigators uncovered was even worse than anyone imagined.
Welcome to The Silent Witness, where we highlight true crime news, unsolved mysteries, unfold chilling stories and events around us to educate and provide information on how we can stay proactive, informed, be security and safety conscious in our environment. The Silent Witness is your go-to destination for gripping accounts of real-life crimes, missing persons, cold cases, and unexplained events. Want to support us and appreciate our craft? Click like, comment, and hit the subscribe button now.
In September 2010, 20 senior students from Graridge Academy, a prestigious private high school nestled in the quiet suburbs of Albany, New York, boarded a bus bound for Mountain Hollow National Park. The trip had been advertised as a weekend retreat, a bonding experience ahead of graduation. Students were told to pack light, leave electronics behind, and prepare for 3 days of team-building activities. At first glance, it seemed like a thoughtful initiative. In reality, it would become one of the most mysterious and disturbing disappearances in recent American history. The organizer, Mr. Doyle Whitmore, was a long-serving faculty member with a background in outdoor education and psychology. Alongside him was Ms. Evelyn Hartley, a soft-spoken but ambitious science teacher with a passion for wilderness therapy. They promised a weekend of growth and challenge. But by the following Monday, the bus was found abandoned just a few hundred feet from the edge of the Hollow's infamous South Ridge Trail. What began as a standard missing persons report soon exploded into a statewide emergency. Mountain Hollow National Park spans nearly 600,000 acres of rugged terrain. It's a place of stark beauty and lurking danger. Though its trails are popular, local legends warn of unexplained vanishings and ghostly sightings. In the 90s, 2 hikers went missing under eerily similar circumstances, but their case was quietly closed due to a supposed misadventure. The bus was unlocked. 20 sleeping bags, 20 backpacks, all neatly arranged inside. A clipboard with student names was taped to the dashboard. Every one of them checked in. But there was no sign of the students. No signs of a struggle. No personal phones or GPS devices. The bus's emergency radio had been dismantled. Parents gathered in the school gymnasium that afternoon, weeping, screaming, demanding answers. Principal Shelley Gwynn offered only vague reassurances. "We're working closely with the authorities," she said. "We expect them to return soon. It's possible they're just lost." But families weren't buying it. Many students had sent last-minute texts to parents or friends, expressing discomfort. One, from Allie Monroe, read, "Ms. Hartley took our phones. She said we don't need distractions. Something feels off." Others wrote similar messages. "Why are we not allowed to call home? This doesn't feel like school-sanctioned. Why are there ropes and tarps like we're staying out all night?" By the second day, search and rescue teams were deployed. Helicopters scanned the woods. Bloodhounds were brought in. But it was as if the students had disappeared into thin air. It would take a week before the first real clue surfaced. A park ranger found a torn piece of clothing tangled in a bramble bush. It was a Graridge Academy hoodie, with the name Maya R. embroidered into the inside tag. What followed was a media firestorm. CNN, Dateline, and True Crime Daily all converged on Albany. News vans camped outside Graridge Academy. The Hollow was sealed to the public. And then, just as pressure was mounting, a local journalist made a disturbing discovery. There was no permit filed for the school to enter the park. The trip hadn't been officially authorized by the school board. The signature on the park registration log? Forged. So if the school didn't approve the trip, who did? The revelation that the trip had not been formally authorized by Graridge Academy sent shockwaves through the community. Parents were enraged. Journalists began digging into the school's administrative history. Within days, the district office was forced to issue a public statement. The excursion had been planned without official approval, and the administration had no prior knowledge of the group entering Mountain Hollow. This contradicted Principal Shelley Nguyen's earlier claims. Under intense scrutiny, she changed her tone in a follow-up interview. "I trusted Mr. Whitmore and Ms. Hartley. They had planned similar retreats in the past. I assumed the paperwork had been filed, but former staff members came forward with conflicting information. One anonymous source, a recently resigned guidance counselor, revealed that Graridge had previously terminated a similar experimental field program back in 2007 after several students reported emotional distress, and one attempted suicide following a leadership retreat. That incident had been hushed up quietly. Whispers of an internal behavioral initiative, codenamed Project Ascend, began circulating online. It was said to be an unorthodox developmental program run by Mr. Whitmore in coordination with a select group of educators. The goal: to push students beyond traditional boundaries through psychological stressors in controlled environments. While the project had reportedly been disbanded, it now appeared to have been revived unofficially. Digging deeper, an investigative journalist from the Albany Herald uncovered emails between Mr. Whitmore and an individual named Dr. Ezra Colt, a controversial figure in educational psychology. Colt had published papers advocating for immersive self-reliance conditioning in young adults. In one email dated 3 weeks before the trip, Whitmore wrote, "The students we've selected for this phase are strong, resilient. I believe they're ready for the immersion. As always, secrecy is key. Evelyn and I will handle the logistics." This revelation shattered any remaining trust parents had in the school. Protests erupted outside the Graridge campus. A Change.org petition to close the school until a full investigation could be completed gained over 80,000 signatures in just 48 hours. Meanwhile, investigators turned their attention to Ms. Hartley. In contrast to Whitmore, who had vanished the day after the students were reported missing, Hartley was still present in Albany, visibly shaken and pale. Initially, she refused to speak to police, citing legal counsel. But under growing pressure, she eventually sat for a recorded interview. What she revealed left detectives stunned. According to Ms. Hartley, the retreat was never meant to be dangerous. It was supposed to simulate survival scenarios that would teach the students leadership, conflict resolution, and endurance. She admitted they had taken away the students' phones and issued them basic supplies: tents, dehydrated meals, fire-starting kits. They were separated into 4 groups and assigned hiking paths that converged at a central base camp. But when she and Whitmore returned to the base camp on the second day to begin the next phase of the program, none of the groups were there. They waited for hours, then days. "I kept thinking they'd just gone off path," Hartley whispered through tears. "I told Doyle we needed to call someone. He told me not to panic, that it was part of the learning curve, that they'd come back when they were ready. But they didn't." Investigators were skeptical. If the students were truly just lost, why had the emergency communication tools been dismantled? Why was there no trace of them anywhere in the hollow? More disturbing still, Hartley claimed Whitmore had a separate satellite phone that she never saw again after that day. The investigation took a chilling turn when they discovered Whitmore's car, abandoned in a rural town 2 hours from the park. In the trunk were camping supplies, a map of the hollow with cryptic markings, and a torn page from a field journal.
Want to support us and appreciate our craft? Click like, comment, and hit the subscribe button now.
On it were scribbled phrases like, "Test initiated, Phase 2, Group 3 unstable," and "Observe reactions when pushed past threshold." Suddenly, this wasn't just a disappearance. It was a psychological experiment gone terribly wrong. Public outrage exploded. Hartley was placed under house arrest pending trial, and a federal task force was assembled to track down Whitmore. A nationwide manhunt began. Meanwhile, survivors from previous Graridge retreats began coming forward anonymously. One 2003 alum posted a chilling message on Reddit. "I was part of the trial group. They told us it was voluntary, but they manipulated us. Sleep deprivation, staged conflicts, even hunger. They called it the fire within. I broke down after 36 hours. They pulled me out and I never went back." The school board disbanded. The district superintendent resigned. But it was only the beginning, because what nobody could explain, what still haunts the town of Albany to this day, was how 20 healthy, resourceful students could vanish without a trace, in broad daylight, just miles from a major park entrance. And what role the school, its teachers and Project Ascend played in ensuring they were never found. As the days turned into weeks, national coverage of the Mountain Hollow disappearance refused to wane. The story had evolved far beyond the mysterious vanishing of 20 students. It had become a symbol of institutional failure, psychological manipulation, and a devastating betrayal of trust. And at the center of it all were two teachers whose intentions were now under a glaring spotlight. Mr. Doyle Whitmore, the enigmatic mastermind behind the retreat, remained at large. With every passing day, the myth around him grew darker. Described by former students as both charismatic and intimidating, Whitmore was a man who believed deeply in the potential of the human psyche. He was known for pushing his students past their perceived limits, sometimes with unsettling results. "He once made me hike 5 miles in a thunderstorm because I forgot my compass," recalled Jordan Blake, class of 2008. "He said I had to earn clarity through chaos. At the time, I thought it was just tough love. Now I see it was something else." Whitmore's educational philosophy, shaped by fringe psychological theory and bolstered by his association with Dr. Ezra Colt, was focused on what he called transformational suffering. He believed true growth could only occur when individuals were stripped of comfort, identity, and safety. Colt, long ostracized from mainstream academia, had been banned from conducting research in several states due to ethical violations. The revelation that he had any contact with a high school educator sent shockwaves through the academic world. Yet Whitmore and Ms. Evelyn Hartley had communicated with Colt extensively. Digital forensics unearthed multiple encrypted emails between the trio. In one, Colt praised Whitmore's decision to use high-performing students from Graridge. "Their minds are ripe. The illusion of privilege makes the breakdown all the more profound. Document everything. Do not intervene, no matter the cries." The implications were horrifying. Despite being under house arrest, Hartley continued to cooperate with investigators. Slowly, she began to unpack the full scope of Project Ascend. She confessed that the students were selected not randomly, but based on psychological profiles, students deemed emotionally adaptable, leadership-prone, or subconsciously compliant. "They weren't just participants," Hartley said in her second interview. "They were subjects." According to her, the first phase involved removing all technological ties and reassigning group roles to intentionally disrupt existing social hierarchies. The students weren't allowed to form their own groups. They were placed into ones that Hartley and Whitmore predicted would result in friction and stress. Alpha personalities were grouped with other dominant students, while quieter students were forced into leadership roles. "The conflict wasn't a byproduct," Hartley admitted. "It was the goal." In parallel, investigators followed new leads into the school's internal structure. One shocking discovery came when an anonymous whistleblower delivered a USB drive to the task force containing hours of video footage, taken from hidden cameras buried in the Hollow's central camp area. The footage was grainy, night vision quality, but unmistakable. It showed the students. On day 1, they appeared confused but hopeful. On day 2, tensions began to rise. Students argued. Some cried. By day 3, the footage showed clear signs of distress. One student pacing endlessly in a circle, another sobbing while clutching a soaked sleeping bag. And then the footage stopped. Forensic analysis determined the recordings were streamed live to a server registered under a shell corporation traced back to Dr. Colt. He had been watching. The revelation sparked a federal criminal investigation into Colt's whereabouts. A search of his former residence uncovered journals filled with disturbing language. One entry, dated mere days before the trip, read, "The real experiment begins when the authority figure removes themselves. Let them turn on each other. Let the primal code awaken." Public faith in Graridge Academy plummeted. The school shut down indefinitely. Former students, terrified by the extent of the manipulation, began organizing support groups and lawsuits. But what happened to the students after day 3? The answer came when a hiker, unaware of the park's restricted status, ventured into a lesser-known ravine near the Hollow's northeast edge. There, tangled in tree roots and covered in moss, he found a makeshift totem made of cloth and carved wood. Entwined in it was a student ID card, Riley Thorne, Search crews descended on the area. Soon they discovered a small underground shelter, crudely dug, lined with thermal blankets, and stocked with scavenged supplies. But no people. Inside, smeared on the wall in charcoal, was a chilling message. Don't trust the teachers. Don't trust each other. We had to choose. It was signed simply Mar. The initials matched Maya Rodriguez, the student whose torn hoodie was found in Chapter 1. She had been a debate captain, an honor student, and a known peacekeeper among her peers. Her note confirmed what everyone feared. The students had turned on each other. A survivor theory began to take shape. Hartley and Whitmore may not have killed anyone directly, but by removing all oversight, they had created a Lord of the Flies scenario. The students, stripped of adult supervision, familiarity, and food, had descended into chaos. One criminal psychologist called it engineered anarchy. What happened in those woods was no accident, it was calculated, designed, tested. And the scariest part? If Colt and Whitmore were willing to do this to 20 hand-picked students from a prestigious school, who's to say it hadn't been done before, or wouldn't be done again? The investigation now had two main goals: find the students, dead or alive, and find Whitmore and Colt. But even as the search intensified, the media began asking a darker question. What if some of the students didn't want to be found? What if they had changed in the hollow and chosen to stay?
Want to support us and appreciate our craft? Click like, comment, and hit the subscribe button now.
As the search for the missing students intensified, the authorities began to consider a chilling possibility: that some of the students may have survived but were deliberately hiding from the rescuers. The discovery of Maya Rodriguez's cryptic message inside the underground shelter had raised troubling questions about the group's disintegration and the secrets they might be keeping. The message was as much a confession as it was a warning. It suggested that the students, once stripped of their typical safety nets, had turned on each other, making unimaginable choices to survive. The idea that they might have chosen to stay hidden in the hollow raised doubts about what had really happened during those final days of the trip. To investigate further, the FBI brought in a team of criminal psychologists, led by Dr. Claire Porter, who specialized in post-traumatic behavior. Porter was tasked with piecing together the psychological effects of the students' disappearance, hoping to understand how they might have reacted under the extreme stress they had endured. Her team reviewed all available footage, interviews with survivors, and forensic evidence, attempting to reconstruct the last days of the retreat. But what they discovered was deeply disturbing. The group of students, originally united by their shared experience at Graridge Academy, had fractured. The psychological toll had driven them to extreme measures, with some students breaking down entirely, others emerging as unexpected leaders, and a few descending into what could only be described as madness. The survivors' behavior suggested that the line between psychological manipulation and genuine mental collapse had been dangerously blurred. The experiments that Mr. Whitmore and Ms. Hartley had subjected them to had not only forced them to question their identity, but had also triggered primal instincts and deep fears they never knew they had. One survivor, Jordan Blake, had come forward with a shocking revelation. He had managed to escape the hollow after 2 weeks in the wilderness, but he refused to speak with investigators for over a year. When he finally did, he explained how the students' relationships had deteriorated into vicious rivalries. The survivors, he said, had formed small factions, each trying to protect themselves at all costs. We had no food. We couldn't trust each other. People were fighting over scraps, Jordan said. It was like we were living in another world. There was no way to escape it, no way to make it stop. As Jordan recounted the horrors he witnessed, investigators began to piece together the story of the students' survival. The initial days had been filled with confusion, fear, and frustration. They had been forced to rely on each other, but the extreme stress led to increasing isolation and paranoia. They told us not to speak. They said we should conserve our energy, Jordan recalled. But we were hungry, and no one knew how to find food. When the first person started talking about leaving, that's when things got really bad. Everyone had their own idea of what we should do, and then it just exploded. Jordan's account aligned with a theory that had begun to take shape among investigators. In the absence of clear leadership and with the students' trust in each other shattered, the group had splintered. A few of the students had attempted to organize and form a cohesive plan, but the overwhelming fear and suspicion had led to violent altercations. The physical and psychological effects of their isolation had been more severe than anyone could have predicted. The students were no longer thinking rationally. Hunger, fatigue, and fear of being abandoned or betrayed by their peers had pushed them to the edge. The students who survived had done so by taking extreme actions, some of which they would later regret. But there was one key detail that haunted the investigation. Not all of the students had been equally affected. A few, including Riley Thorne, had remained eerily composed throughout the ordeal. They had managed to retain their ability to think clearly, even in the direst of circumstances. The survival of these students, some of whom had once been considered weak or timid, raised further questions. What made some students capable of surviving and thriving in the chaos of the Hollow, while others fell apart? Was it truly just a matter of psychological resilience, or had something else been at play? The authorities turned to Dr. Claire Porter's psychological profile of the surviving students, hoping that it could offer some insight into their differing reactions. Dr. Porter's findings were unsettling. The students who had managed to maintain their composure, Riley Thorne among them, had been subjected to a different kind of psychological stress. They had been pushed to their limits, yes, but they had also been trained to survive. Riley had been a standout in the school's survival skills program. She had demonstrated exceptional resilience in previous school activities, even under pressure. This, it seemed, had made her one of the few students who was actually prepared for the horrific situation they found themselves in. But there was another possibility that lingered in the minds of investigators. Could some of the students have been trained without their knowledge? Could there have been a hidden agenda, a plan within the psychological experiment that had premeditated the students' differing reactions? Had they been manipulated into survival roles, playing parts in a greater experiment? To investigate this, investigators expanded their search, looking into Graridge Academy's past and its association with unusual programs. It was during this deep dive that a former faculty member, who had resigned years earlier, came forward with a startling revelation. "I was part of a program at Graridge years ago, before all of this," the anonymous source revealed. "I didn't know everything about it, but I remember hearing whispers of a project. I didn't ask questions at the time, but looking back, I think they were training students for something bigger than just a class. They called it Project Ascend." The whistleblower's testimony fueled the investigation. Theories about the project began to circulate, including the chilling possibility that the students had been part of a larger psychological experiment, one that involved more than just the retreat at Mountain Hollow. Could the disappearance have been part of a greater, sinister scheme to test human behavior in extreme circumstances? Dr. Claire Porter's team continued their analysis, exploring the psychological breakdowns, the factions, and the potential for a larger plan. But one key question remained unanswered. Why had so many students vanished without a trace? It wasn't until a month after the disappearance that another clue surfaced. A hiker, deep within the park's farthest reaches, stumbled upon a hidden cave system. Inside, he discovered the skeletal remains of two individuals, neither of whom matched the description of any of the missing students. The discovery added another layer of mystery to the case. Who were these people, and what were they doing so deep within the park? The authorities raced to excavate the cave, but they found no answers. The remains were far too old, and the cave had not been marked on any official maps. Yet the discovery hinted at something much darker. Could there have been more to the disappearances than anyone had imagined?
Want to support us and appreciate our craft? Click like, comment, and hit the subscribe button now.
Was the park itself hiding a secret, one that stretched back long before the students ever set foot in it? For now, the mystery of the Mountain Hollow disappearances remained unsolved. The authorities had more questions than answers, and the search for the missing students, and the people responsible for their disappearance, was far from over. The search for the missing students had slowed, but the investigation into the Mountain Hollow disappearances was far from over. The FBI and local law enforcement were piecing together the scattered remains of the case, but something about it didn't add up. The authorities had hoped the discovery of the cave would provide answers, but it only deepened the mystery. Who were those remains? How long had they been there? And what was their connection to the events that had transpired in 2010? As months passed, the public's fervor began to wane. Graridge Academy was a shadow of its former self. News outlets moved on to other stories, and the school quietly swept the controversy under the rug. But a small group of tenacious journalists, investigators, and former students refused to let the case die. They continued to dig, determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant uncovering something far darker than anyone could imagine. In the months following the discovery of the remains in the cave, Dr. Claire Porter and her team revisited their findings. They had spent hours combing through the surviving students' interviews, but one glaring inconsistency had started to bother them. Riley Thorne, one of the students who had been notably resilient during the wilderness ordeal, had repeatedly mentioned a mysterious figure who wasn't part of the official trip roster. She called him the Watcher. At first, investigators dismissed this as a figment of Riley's stress-induced paranoia, but something in her account caught their attention. She described how she and her group had been stalked, watched from a distance, by a man she had never seen before. He wore dark clothing and always stayed at the edges of their campfires, never approaching too closely. Every time they ventured deeper into the park, Riley claimed, they could sense someone observing them, but whenever they tried to confront him, he would vanish into the trees. But Riley wasn't the only one who had seen him. Several other students reported similar experiences. Some had seen him watching from the shadows. Others heard footsteps when no one else was around. No one could agree on who he was or what he wanted, but the man's presence had sent a ripple of unease through the group. Dr. Porter's team soon realized that this wasn't a case of mass delusion. Riley's story, and the corroborating testimonies, suggested that there was someone else in the park during the student's disappearance. The question was, who was he? And what was his connection to the school, the teachers, or the mysterious Project Ascend? In an attempt to uncover more, the investigation team interviewed everyone who had been involved with Graridge Academy's past field programs. They focused on faculty members who had worked alongside Mr. Whitmore and Ms. Hartley, hoping to uncover any hidden agendas. It was during these interviews that another startling revelation surfaced. A former student, someone who had participated in a previous Graridge retreat in the early 2000s, had mentioned a name that made investigators freeze: Dr. Ezra Colt, the same controversial psychologist who had communicated with Mr. Whitmore about the survival immersion techniques. Colt was a name that had been whispered about in academic circles for years. Known for his extreme methods in studying human behavior, Colt had once been a rising star in educational psychology. But his work had taken a darker turn after several incidents involving young adults under his care. He believed in pushing human endurance to its limits, testing the very boundaries of what the mind could endure under stress. Colt had been involved in multiple lawsuits, but none of them had ever amounted to much. He had quietly faded from public life after being banned from several academic institutions. But he had never stopped working. Investigators soon learned that Colt had kept close contact with Mr. Whitmore, even after his academic career had crumbled. In fact, it appeared that Colt had been the mastermind behind Project Ascend, advising Whitmore on how to implement his methods within Graridge's field programs. Colt had believed that pushing students to their breaking point would unlock hidden strengths, revealing who could truly thrive under pressure and who would crumble. Project Ascend was not just an educational program. It was an experiment in psychological manipulation, designed by Colt and carried out by Whitmore, under the guise of leadership retreats and wilderness therapy. And it had been running for years. But the worst discovery came when investigators uncovered a hidden notebook belonging to Mr. Whitmore. Inside were detailed records of the students chosen for the 2010 trip, as well as notes about each student's perceived weaknesses and potential for breakdown. Whitmore had been systematically selecting students to push past their mental and physical limits, testing them in ways that went far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The notes included phrases like, Phase 1, weakness identified, Phase 2, collapse imminent, and monitor, subject shows potential for compliance under stress. The shocking truth became clear. The 2010 retreat was no accident. It was a carefully orchestrated experiment, designed to test the students' resilience, to manipulate them into survival situations, and to observe how they responded. The disappearance wasn't just a failure. It was part of the experiment's dark conclusion. The students had been abandoned, pushed to the brink of their sanity, with no intention of rescuing them until the experiment had played out. And somewhere in the depths of Mountain Hollow, one or more students had been left behind. Riley Thorne, now one of the few survivors, was at the center of the investigation. It was she who had experienced the greatest psychological shift during the ordeal. And it was she who had come closest to discovering the full extent of the project. During her time in the park, Riley had uncovered something that could change everything. Hidden beneath a pile of debris in a remote area of the hollow was a wooden chest. Inside, she found notebooks, letters, and documents related to Project Ascend. Everything she had suspected but couldn't prove. These documents tied Mr. Whitmore, Ms. Hartley, and Dr. Colt to a secret, government-backed psychological experiment that had been running in various forms for decades. The project had never been sanctioned. It was a covert operation designed to test the mental limits of young adults, observing how they responded to manipulation, isolation, and extreme fear. But the most chilling piece of evidence Riley had uncovered was a file on the cave system that had been discovered months earlier. According to the documents, the cave had been used as an experimental site long before the students' disappearance. The truth was finally coming to light, but with it came even more questions. Who else had known about the project? Who had funded it? And what had really happened to the 20 missing students? The Hollow held its secrets, but soon enough, the world would learn them.
Want to support us and appreciate our craft? Click like, comment, and hit the subscribe button now.
The search for the truth had taken a dark turn, and now, at long last, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. But there was still one question that haunted the investigators. Where were the students? And who was responsible for their disappearance? The discovery of Dr. Colt's involvement in Project Ascend had sent shockwaves through the educational community, but even more shocking was the revelation that Colt had continued to work with Whitmore and Hartley under the radar. His psychological experiments, designed to manipulate young minds, had gone far beyond anything anyone could have imagined. And now, the world knew what had happened to the students of Graridge Academy. The remains found in the cave had been linked to two students, Maya R. and Jonah Parker. Their bodies had been left behind, but not in the traditional sense. They had died as a result of the experiment. The other students, including Riley Thorne, had been miraculously found alive, though not unscathed. They had endured mental and physical torture for days, but it was their minds that had been pushed to the brink. The students who survived would never be the same again. As investigators delved deeper, they uncovered evidence of Dr. Colt's long-running experimentation on vulnerable young adults. His unapproved trials in wilderness therapy were now public knowledge. Colt had manipulated and abused these students under the guise of educational development. The psychological breakdowns, the erratic behavior, and the forced survival tactics were all part of his twisted agenda. But Colt was a master manipulator, and no one had seen his true intentions until it was too late. By the time authorities had gathered enough evidence to charge Dr. Colt, Mr. Whitmore, and Ms. Hartley, the damage had already been done. The national backlash was immediate. Lawsuits flooded in from families who had lost their children, and the Graridge Academy was sued for its involvement in the covert project. Whitmore and Hartley were arrested, but Colt was never found. It was believed that he had gone into hiding, his manipulation tactics now fully exposed to the world. The investigation's final, tragic revelation came when investigators discovered the true scope of Colt's influence. He had been working with government agencies in the shadows, funded by private donors who believed in his controversial methods. The project had been far-reaching, involving dozens of other students from different parts of the country. And it had been ongoing for years, hidden from the public eye. The disappearances in Mountain Hollow were just one chapter in a much larger, sinister story. But the story didn't end with Colt's disappearance. For the students who survived, the nightmare was far from over. They had been subjected to intense psychological manipulation, forced to face their deepest fears in ways that no one should ever have to endure. But in the end, They were the ones who had survived, who had lived to tell the tale. Riley Thorne, now in her 20s, was one of the few survivors who had actively helped the investigation. She had spoken out about the abuse and the trauma she had suffered, and her courage had inspired others to come forward. The media had once seen her as a victim, but she was now recognized as a hero, someone who had not only survived the horrors of the Hollow but had helped bring the truth to light. In the aftermath of the disaster, Mountain Hollow National Park was closed to the public. The Graridge Academy was permanently shut down, its reputation forever tarnished. But there was still one remaining question that haunted everyone involved in the case. Could anything have been done to prevent the disappearances? Could the students have been saved? As the years passed, the story of the Mountain Hollow disappearances faded from the headlines, but it remained in the hearts and minds of those who had been touched by it. For the surviving students, the scars would never fade. But in some way, they had found a sense of peace, knowing that they had exposed the truth and brought justice to those who had been lost in the Hollow. And while the mystery of Dr. Ezra Colt and his twisted experiments remained unsolved, one thing was clear: the dark secrets of Mountain Hollow would never be forgotten. The case of the Mountain Hollow disappearances became a turning point in the world of psychology, education, and public safety. In the years following the scandal, new laws were enacted to regulate wilderness programs and educational retreats, ensuring that no such experiment could ever take place again. Riley Thorne went on to study psychology, determined to ensure that no one would ever fall prey to the same manipulative practices she had endured. She became an advocate for mental health awareness and spoke at conferences, sharing her story and the lessons learned from her ordeal. As for the victims of the Mountain Hollow tragedy, their memories were honored in a public memorial. The park itself was restructured, its history now forever tied to the dark chapter that had once unfolded there. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearances, survivors and families gathered to remember the lost, to pay tribute to those whose lives had been forever changed by the events of that fateful weekend. But one thing was certain: the truth had been revealed, the story had been told, and Mountain Hollow, with all its haunting mysteries, would never be the same.